God bless you, everybody. We were recently talking about the feasts of the Lord in our class, and here's a great question concerning Easter Sunday and the date that we celebrate the resurrection of Jesus. Someone in the class asked the question. Last year, I realized that Passover and Easter fell within the same week for the first time in about 50 years, if I'm not mistaken. I was surprised. Jesus died a few hours before Passover. I have a Christian colleague who's Greek, but he celebrates Easter on a different date than us. I'm curious as to why we've never aligned our dates to celebrate Easter the day after Jews celebrate Passover. This is a fantastic question, really a fantastic set of questions, because there are two parts to this question. The first question is why we don't tie the date of Easter more closely to the date of the Passover. In the early church, there was a dispute about this that went on for centuries. Today, we call it the Quartodeciman controversy. The word quartodeciman means something that has to do with the number 14. Churches in the East, closer to the Middle East, had a tendency to celebrate Easter on the 14th day of the Hebrew month of Nisan. That's when the Passover took place. The theory was that we ought to celebrate Jesus' resurrection at Passover because that is, after all, when it took place, and because it's important for us to keep that symbolism connected to it. Jesus fulfilled the Passover in himself. He is our Passover. He is the Lamb of God, and so on. Separating the Christian feast of the resurrection from the feast of Passover and the feast of first fruits would be a tremendous loss, and it would undercut the proclamation of what Jesus did. So these people might celebrate the resurrection on whatever day of the week the 14th of Nisan might have fallen on that year, even if it were, let's say, a Tuesday or a Thursday. On the other side of this controversy, you had people in the Western Roman Empire, people around Rome, who wanted to celebrate Easter on Sunday. And they also have a good point, right? Jesus rising from the dead on Sunday carries with it important symbolism as well. Sunday is the first day of the week, and creation began on Sunday. Jesus' resurrection, then taking place on the first day of the week, is a sign that God is beginning a new creation in him. Now, the Western believers supposedly traced their tradition back to Peter and Paul, whereas the churches in the East traced their tradition back to the Apostle John. I'm oversimplifying this now because this can be a very involved history. But in the second century, around the year 155 AD, we have two historical figures disputing this. We have Polycarp, and Polycarp was the bishop of Smyrna in Asia Minor, modern day Turkey. You might have heard of Polycarp because the story of his martyrdom is perhaps the most famous martyrdom story in the early church. And when Polycarp visited Rome, the bishop of Rome at that time was a man named Anicetus, we might say in English. He was not persuaded to become a quartodeciman like Polycarp, but as things ended up, he didn't mind if Polycarp kept up the old practice of the 14th of Nisan, which Polycarp claimed had come from the Apostle John himself. And so both sides had the liberty to celebrate the resurrection as they each saw fit. But in the following generation, close to the year 200 AD, there was a bishop of Rome named Victor, and he wanted to stop the quartodecimans. He wanted to suppress that practice, and he wanted to create uniformity, I guess. So I suppose it was inevitable that as the church continued to drift further away from its Jewish roots, that eventually there would be fewer and fewer people over time who would use a Jewish calculation for these dates. And the quartodecimans did continue on for a few more centuries, although in reduced numbers. They separated out for a time and even had their own little church for a season. Now, in the early church, the most famous church council, other than the council that we read about in the book of Acts, in Acts chapter 15, was the Council of Nicaea, which we usually call Nicaea in English. Nicaea was the first ecumenical council. That means it was a gathering or an attempt to gather, at any rate, the entire church through its bishops, through its representatives. One of the things that Nicaea decided was that Easter should be on the same date for everybody, no matter where you are. The entire church should be celebrating the same date. That's important. So they wanted the whole church across the entire world to celebrate the Feast of the Resurrection on the same day. Have to remember that in these early centuries, there was one church, at least on paper anyway. The Eastern Church and the Western Church had not yet divided. That would not happen until the 11th century. So the Council of Nicaea said that Easter needs to be uniform, and they also said that it has to be calculated without referring at all to the Hebrew calendar. That doesn't mean that they resolved everything, that they resolved all the issues by no means. In fact, it took a while, it really took centuries, really, for church leaders to work things out more or less completely. And the way that we now calculate Easter, as this continued to be hammered out over those first few centuries in the church, is that Easter takes place on the first Sunday after the first full moon after March 21st. That's basically how it's calculated. That is called the Paschal first moon, which is a little bit ironic because Paschal, even in the word, implies a connection to Passover, right? So that's how we've ended up with our calculation of Easter. Now, the second question that goes with that is, how do we come up with celebrating the resurrection on a different date from people in the Eastern Orthodox Church? Well, the calendar that we use in most countries today is called the Gregorian calendar. It is named after Pope Gregory XIII. He is the Pope, he's the person who reformed the existing calendar back in the 1580s. So before that, people commonly used the Julian calendar. And as you might suspect from the name, the Julian calendar was developed by none other than Julius Caesar. The Julian calendar had a problem, though. The Julian calendar assumed that there are exactly 365 and a quarter days in a year, but there aren't. It's actually a pinch less than that. You scientists among us can look it up. I think it's 365.2422 days or something like that. Now, that's not a big difference, but over time, those little pinches here and there tend to add up, as they do in all of life. So the effect of following the Julian calendar is that every 400 years, let's say, the Julian calendar drifts 3 days further behind. So the Greek Orthodox Church has never changed that for religious purposes. Now, those countries in the East, Greece and other countries, Russia, they do follow the Gregorian calendar for civil matters, but a lot of the Orthodox Church folks still use the Julian calendar for religious purposes. And so with the drifting that is built in, because, Julius Caesar was not a modern astronomer, right? That's why the churches in the Orthodox setting, that's why they are by now, at this point, 13 days behind the Gregorian calendar. So the Greek Christmas, as many people call it, comes on January 7th, and it will continue to do so for quite a few years yet. And Easter will follow 13 days behind the date that Easter is celebrated in the Western churches, in the Roman Catholic world and in the Protestant world. So they are still following Julius Caesar's calendar, while the rest of us have adjusted the calendar in order to first keep the seasons more or less where we know them, but really more importantly, to keep Easter connected to the approximate beginning of spring, and also to keep it somewhat connected to the timing of the Passover, although, again, always on a Sunday. So the Quartodecimans lost the argument in history, and the Western Church's idea that Easter should always be on a Sunday is what prevailed. So hopefully that's not too convoluted. It is a little complicated, but it's not too convoluted. You really have two things happening. You have the people who wanted to connect it to Passover lost the historical argument, and then the calendar changed, and so the Greek calendar is behind the Western calendar, and that is why we celebrate Resurrection Sunday when we do in the Western world. So that's a quick answer, believe me, to what is a very long history in the history of the church. So thanks for listening, and keep your questions coming in. They are great. We really do appreciate them. God bless you.